So it's Simeon, no doubt. We've notified your subscribers. We're connecting. I suspect there's a few extra people on the Substack app at the moment because.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. We're live. Well, hello to everyone who is a subscriber to the Kaka and no doubt is a very big fan of Greater Auckland. This is the daddy of the blogs, which really changed the landscape for urbanism debate in Auckland and, of course, the rest of the country. And with us at the moment is Connor Sharp, a writer for Greater Auckland, which is now on both Substack and as its own blog and email newsletter. Connor, lovely to have you on this video chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So the reason I got you on today is we've got a new minister. We weren't really expecting this even a day or so ago. Simeon Brown has really dominated the transport sector for over a year now as the man who has upended it all. He's making all sorts of recommendations and has a view of the world which is completely at odds with those people who've been studying transport, urbanism, urban form, how to get around cities easily, options for travellers, how to reduce congestion, let alone reducing climate emissions. He's been very focused on building motorways, on stopping funding cycling, and also cutting back in real terms on funding for public transport, in particular new trains, but also buses as well. So from an urbanism, pro public transport, let's try and get our emissions down point of view, Simeon Brown has been a real problem. let's put it that way. But he's gone now. He's no longer the transport minister. He's the health minister. And I'd like to sort of look at this now from a transport point of view, because every story has a silver lining, and maybe Simeon Brown moving into health, at least for transport, has a silver lining. What's your view now that we have Chris Bishop in as the transport minister? Tell us how he might think about things differently.
Yeah, I think it's Chris Bishop is, he's still a National Party politician, right? You're still going to get things around, let's say, private financing with like public-private partnerships, and you'll probably still get things around like user pays, tolling, that kind of thing. But I think Chris Bishop has also demonstrated in, particularly as Minister of Housing, that he does understand a lot of the urban development and urbanism aspect of cities. And so probably would be a lot more favorable towards things like cycling, mass transit. But there's also the caveat that there has been a year and a bit of momentum in a certain direction, which might prevent him from reversing any of that if he wanted to.
Yeah, let's go into a bit more depth about what Simeon Brown has actually done and how difficult or easy it might be to unwind it if Chris Bishop was so inclined. So it seems to me that the main piece of DNA that he's changed in our transport system is the government policy statement on transport, which he got in there quite quickly and really just rewrote it, changed its main objectives from reducing emissions and reducing congestion, and really said, well, this is all about motorways. That's the end of it. So could you take us through a bit more about how the government policy statement on transport influences how money is spent by not just NZTA, Waka Kotahi, but also the councils?
Yeah, he actually went quite a bit further in many ways. It seems like he probably wrote the thing himself. But so the GPS essentially sets out the government strategy for transport and kind of allocates funding towards for NZTA to then allocate to the sort of the priority of central government projects as well as councils. So the way the GPS is written, which is quite different from prior versions, is Simeon basically separated out the different modes. So let's say you wanted to build a road and you had a footpath and a cycle lane. In the past, you're building that project. Primarily, it's a roading project, so you take it out of the roading part of the funding, he explicitly, removed that. So if you want to build a road, you need to take the roading part out of the roading funding and the cycling part out of the walking and cycling funding, right? So that means it's a lot more complicated to actually fund these projects. And New Zealand's already complicated enough to fund projects, right? So basically that scuppers a lot of the smaller projects. In terms of the bigger stuff, the GPS also kind of sets out the priorities of the big things are the RONs, right? So these are the motorways. In the GPS, it's been mandated that these are 4-lane motorways, which you're basically making it the biggest scope it can be. So they're going to be the most expensive it can be. And that's still in there. So when we sort of, so you couple that with, as you've kind of mentioned, around removing things like considering climate change. And so when Chris Bishop comes in now, he's still got that, right? That's still the framework he's working within. So it might be that he's wants to scale back some of those RONs, but how can you do that if it's mandated already in government policy? What happens if you want to build more cycleways? Like all that kind of stuff is already set in stone a little bit. So how much wiggle room there is, you're probably not going to get like public statements, big public reversals, but most of the like anything you would want to reverse would have to be in the back end. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think it's worth going into a bit of detail about one example in particular of a funding change which seemed not only blunt and abrupt and a real blunt instrument, but also went against the opinions and the work over many years of locals to essentially make a particular crossroads much safer and also connect up a part of the town with the new residential areas with cycleways. And that's the Warkworth crossroads. Could you tell us a bit more about, for those who aren't aware, about the Warkworth crossroads and what went on there?
Yeah, so just a bit of context. So Warkworth is located in a sort of national stronghold electorate, right? So we're talking about true blue, votes national basically every time. And for the last, well, I sort of grew up in the area, and as long as I've been alive, plus many decades before that, there is an infamous intersection called the Hill Street intersection. And this has been dubbed the worst intersection in New Zealand. If you go on Google Maps and look it up, you'll understand why. And a lot of the solutions for it have kind of been pushed back year after year. But over the last 5 years, there has been a lot of work from the local community, particularly through the business association, to develop a solution for this. And they've got I can't remember the exact name for it, the sort of, they've developed quite good relationships with Auckland Transport as well as the local national MP, the councillor. There was a Labour list MP who was there for quite a few years. So it was a very sort of community-driven, bipartisan approach, bringing in like the schools, bringing in the community. And they developed a solution that would solve this problem once and for all. And
because it's a weird crossroads, isn't it? It's like you've got
yes,
two things where it's not exactly clear which way you should go. There are some people who, and big trucks and various other things, are going through quite quickly. There are often accidents there. And the idea of having, a cyclist going through there just scares everyone witless. And this solution would have slowed down the traffic, made it a lot safer, but also made it a lot easier for people to cycle into town from their suburb area, which was due to be built. And
yeah.
this seemed to go against the flow, not only of what the locals wanted, but also the need for new residential development, which the government's keen on.
Yeah. So I think there's slated to be, probably a few more thousand residents moving in north of the intersection. And so this is kind of a really critical link between that and the sort of southern part of town, which has the schools and stuff like that. But because it had cycleways, it had raised crossings, all of these things have been, they were essentially banned from the GPS and the policies. So it meant all this work that had gone into developing this solution it got dropped, right? Who knows if it's the end of the story? I know that there's still a lot of work in the background to try and get something happening, but it went from a project that was ready to go and has stopped in its tracks, right? And you can actually look at the big picture, and this has kind of happened to projects all over the country. And considering how much we pay for infrastructure, if you're constantly canceling these projects just for the most spurious reasons, as having cycleways, it's not a good way to do things.
Yeah, and I just thinking about the way that this decision yesterday by Christopher Luxon to replace Shane Retty with Simeon Brown was framed by Luxon and by the media, which was that Simeon Brown had been a successful minister as transport minister. He had, quote, got things done, that he had kept things simple, and that he was, making progress. And sure, he wasn't particularly popular with the councils, but hey, that was like a badge of honour. But I wonder about that because when Simeon Brown got in, and to be fair, with Chris Bishop and Nicola Willis, there was like this immediate eruption of cancellations, not just of local transport projects, but of course the rail ferries, which is not just a decision about boats; it's also a decision about ports and about connections to the rail networks, whether or not the South Island actually has a viable rail network. And on top of that, you had a lot of the contracting sector, what they call the horizontal infrastructure sector, the Civil Contractors Association, saying, "Hey, we had some certainty, and suddenly it's all up in the air, and we're having to lay people off. There are people flying off to Australia to work in the infrastructure sector there." This seems to be one of the themes of the first 6 months of the government, which was the cancellation of Kāinga Ora project planning, and then the series of cancellations of actual projects that would have been underway. So we had consents done, we had planning done, often the pipes had been done. It was just a matter of putting the houses in on top. They were stopped. We also saw the planning of hospitals, and in particular the Dunedin hospital, stopped. But a lot of the transport stuff was stopped as well. And on top of that, Simeon Brown was the local government minister. So he had a lot to do with the decisions being made around Three Waters and the reforms there. And he spent a lot of time blaming the councils for putting up rates, when actually it was the new government's decision, albeit promised in the election, to remove and repeal Three Waters and replace it with something else that froze a large part of the construction sector in a state of suspended animation. And I do wonder if actually this solved a couple of problems for, perceived problems by Christopher Luxon. He wasn't getting much joy and health, but actually behind the scenes in local government and in transport, he wasn't getting much joy, certainly from those blue blood electorates from Simeon Brown. What do you think?
I think that a lot of the actions undertaken in the last year and a bit, I don't think the chickens have come home to roost. Because a lot of these projects have stopped, it takes a bit of time for, that construction pipeline to grind to a halt. When you try and restart that, a lot of people will have left overseas, and so you'll lose a lot of expertise. I think with other actions around, like, the road safety stuff is a big thing, which we haven't gone over, but it's a really big push by Simeon Brown, and that's going to result in people dying, and that's going to start to come up, like the consequences of that, right?
The irony
If we
is now his job is to try and deal with it at the other end.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, and speaking, like they're sort of underfunding, like health has been underfunded, and a lot of that money has gone towards funding these um, the roads and national significance. But the funding for that ends in, I think, 3 years or something, and there's not really any clear way that they're going to fund that, and that's tens of billions of dollars. Like, it's a lot of money, and so while it might look like the actions that have been done seem like he's doing a lot, in many ways he is doing a lot. It's just they're very short term, right? The consequences of which we haven't seen yet, at least not explicitly.
That's
And
right, and he can now move on and let somebody else deal with it and not have to take
yeah,
responsibility for it. Just finally, we forget that not only was Simeon Brown the local government and the transport minister, he was also the energy minister. And there was, and obviously, it makes sense to have your transport and energy minister together. If you've got an issue with electricity and you've got some sort of transition going on and you want to reduce emissions, they're actually a good combo to have. But his first instinct, whenever there was any sort of issues, an electricity crisis, but also, one of the first things he did was get rid of the clean car discount scheme, completely killed dead the momentum that was growing in the sales of new electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. There was a real surge that went on, and even though those clean car discounts have gone now, and actually the prices are not that much higher than they were before after the discounts, the whole idea that people are not getting their free government money, if you like, has completely, whacked the car dealership and new car sales sector. So this is the other thing we forget that. Sure, there's a lot of people who are, I suppose you could say, greenies, very keen on emissions reduction, who are not happy with the approach. But there's also a lot of hard-nosed capitalists who suddenly have seen their sales pipelines dry up,
yeah,
and also, there's a lot of frustration in the car sector about what happened with energy and in electricity, where the first instinct of Simeon Brown, when there was a problem with the electricity market over the winter, was to go, well, let's bring in gas, let's bring in LNG. We're not going to do much with this solar thing. He virtually talked very rarely about solar. So what do you think? We've got a new minister now. It's Simon Watts. He's the uh, current climate change minister. So
mm.
there is some synergy there, climate change and energy. Any suggestion that he might do things differently than Simeon Brown?
it's it's hard to say because I think over the last year he's definitely played second fiddle. Um, and if you look at the economics of energy, for example, solar has become, I mean, arguably, in many cases, you might not even need subsidies for it to be cheaper than other forms of energy, right? And so, if you do put subsidies, it just supercharges that. So, if he was looking at it in that sense, there might be a real opportunity to get away from natural gas and not spend billions of dollars on that, and move towards solar. Perhaps something to do with electric vehicles as well. Probably not going to see that just because of the politics around it, but there is an opportunity to move to it. I don't know what Simon Watts will do. Um, it's hard to kind of know what he thinks is, has to be in the spotlight, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, my impression, having interviewed him a couple of times around climate change, is that he's really dealing with the policies put in front of him. He used to sell them. He hasn't been
yeah,
driving the policy. He may have more opportunities to drive the policy now that he's the energy minister as well as climate change. But again, to really make a difference, you need to have a completely different vibe. You have to go out there and say that solar panels are good, that
yeah,
that batteries are good, that it is good that people move into electric bikes and electric cars. Where you just have
yeah.
not got a single. It's like it's seen as a third rail of conservative politics to even talk about solar and electric and transition and emissions reduction.
I,
It's quite a different thing.
I think this is kind of the one. This is the one thing, or not the one thing, but this is one of the big things that kind of Simeon's done over the last year and a half is around the politics of things, around driving up that sort of culture war. I say populism, but it's not based on evidence. It's based on driving up emotion about things, and that's really, it'll be interesting to see what will happen. One, now that he's health minister, but two, for the people who've picked up his portfolios, if they're going to kind of be stuck with that, or if maybe they'll try and change tack. But difficult shoes, but there's some optimism there, I think.
Yes,
Just tough. It's
now that the culture warrior has gone, we,
he's in a
we
health system now, so we'll see what
yeah,
happens.
that's an interesting one to see if he picks up those culture war angles in health. It's fantastic, Connor. Thank you very much, Connor Sharp, here with us from Greater Auckland, which is
Yeah.
now on Substack as well. Lovely to see you. Thanks again for your time, and we'll keep an eye out for more from Greater Auckland.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.